slight distraction. Fascism, an alliance between business and government based on a strong military, powerful military. Truth is that in a fascist state, there's very seldom any unemployment because if you're not employed, you go into the military. And it's all motivated by a very strong fanatic nationalism. This idea that we are the greatest people on earth, we should rule, we are doing everyone good if we in fact were in charge. So this economic system controlled by business and the state government with a huge military investment and this kind of rabid kind of nationalism. Mussolini begins the system in the 1920s in Italy. And it does have some success. People who traveled to Italy in the 1920s said that the economy was running. That famous saying about the trains in Italy ran on time under the fascists. And when the Great Economic Depression of 1929 hit, Italy was really felt the least impact of it, or at least it lasted longer without feeling the huge impact from the Great Depression than other European states. Of course, one of the major problems with fascism is if you keep building up the military and you keep pumping people with this huge fanatic nationalism, you usually end up with conflict. Fascism usually ends up leading to an authoritarian state and to war, and that's exactly what will happen in Europe. Let's move out of Italy for the moment. We'll get back to when the war begins, World War II. Let's talk about France. France's major problem between the wars was political instability. It had a parliamentary system in which whatever party gains a majority of representatives runs the government. Now, the problem is if you don't have a majority of representatives, you have to create an alliance of parties called a coalition government. A coalition government can be made up of 2 or 5 or how many parties as long as the total ends up being a majority of the representatives. Problem with that is if any one of the parties at any time gets disgruntled or angry and decides to leave the coalition, the government collapses. And the government collapses, you've got to then have new elections. France had a lot of political instability between the wars because they were constantly having coalition governments, constantly collapsing, really were lacking direction and lacking really strong leadership. So when events began to hit crisis mode, the French are not really sure how to handle things. Should they go forward? Should they be aggressive? Should they back off? Britain, on the other hand, Britain doesn't have that kind of confusion. Britain's political system was pretty stable. But the British and the British Empire had gone through a real soul-searching transformation after World War I. They had been the nation that had led the Industrial Revolution. They had been the nation that had opened up free markets, created empires, and led the empire movement. And yet, after World War I, they began to rethink and think, maybe we got to change our approach. After World War I, Britain began to try to create a welfare state, a socialist state, a state where, under socialism, the poor would be given at least a minimum standard of living. And that meant high taxes, and that meant staying away from expensive adventures like war, right? So when things began to become a crisis in Europe, the British tried to stay out as long as possible. They did not want war because they were focusing on creating this welfare state. Germany. Germany after World War I was probably the most devastated of all the countries. Its economy was shot, and it had a new government. It had been ruled by royalty and Kaiser Wilhelm, but the Kaiser had been expelled at the end of the war. He had been sent off into exile, and the Versailles Treaty had created a new government in Germany, something called the Weimar Republic, spelled with a W, W-E-I-M-A-R, the Weimar Republic. A democratic representative government. It had a lot of problems, though. First of all, the Weimar Republic was in power when the Versailles Treaty was completed, which meant that it had to sign this treaty, a treaty that almost all Germans hated. Not the Kaiser who had started the war or led Germany in the war, but in fact this new government. On top of that, it was a government that's based on democracy, representation. These are all ideas that were foreign to most Germans. And we have this idea sometimes of this fantasy that if we just set up democracy in the country, people will just come flocking and be supported automatically. It doesn't work that way. Most Germans didn't understand the new government, and they didn't trust the new government. And then, of course, you had Germany's economic problems and inflation running high to the point of million-mark notes are being created just to buy groceries. Inflation that destroyed wealth, destroyed savings, and sent Germany down into really a very bad economic situation long before even the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hits, Germany's hit even worse. The German people, on top of that, have been branded as the pariahs of the world, causing World War II. They were blamed for the war. World War I. They were blamed for the war. So there was a lot of anger, a lot of disillusionment, a lot of confusion in Germany. You know, we have this term alternative lifestyles. We often talk about people choosing different ways than what society might consider or define as normal. Germany, especially Berlin, between the wars, was a time in which you found all kinds of extreme alternative lifestyles. People were experimenting. People were trying new things, including governments and including social norms and social customs. Now, when we cross the Atlantic, we'll talk about Russia later, guys. When we cross the Atlantic, we come to the United States. The United States has always had a luxury that when they don't really like what's going on internationally, we tend to go back to our isolationist roots. In the 19th century, and the United States declared itself essentially isolationist. We weren't going to get involved in the rest of the world. And we had got involved in World War I, and many Americans felt disillusioned by this. We always go, as a country, we believe we go to war for freedom, democracy, and all the catchphrases that we think of that represent the best of us and we want for the world. And even if those aren't the real reasons, we always believe it. So that when World War I ended and the Versailles Treaty was signed and there was really no mention of self-determination, this democracy representation, all the ideals we thought we had gone to war for and Americans had died for, Americans once again turned their back on the world and said, no, we want none of this. In the 1920s, the United States, while we were involved economically with the world, we really cut back on our involvement with politics and international politics. We did not join the League of Nations, and while we did sign some treaties in trade and military treaties, we kept everybody pretty much at an arm's length. In 1929, primarily because of the banking situation, the United States suffered the Great Economic Depression, which sent us into a bigger tailspin and even more focused domestically on domestic issues rather than being really involved in what was happening in foreign affairs. So unlike the European countries who were trying new things, the United States went back to its more conservative roots. The 1920s were certainly a conservative period. Which leads us to Russia. How does that lead us to Russia? Well, we did a general overview, guys. We're going to talk in more detail about events that were occurring in the lead up to World War II. But we do need to take a look at Russia during this time period. In order to do that, and looking at the Russian Revolution, we're going to start this off in roughly about 1903. By 1903, Russia is controlled by the Tsar, controlled by an aristocracy that owns most of the land, owns most of the wealth. It has a large peasant class, it has a small professional class, and a small working class. In 1903, it did have a representative institution, the Duma. And this representative institution did have parties, and these parties did debate and did pass legislation, but they had no real power over the Tsar. They were really a place where people argued, debated, and the Tsar pretty much made up the decisions. But amongst these political parties, you had some pretty powerful groups, at least groups that went through the motions. You had the Provisional Democrats. These were, the Provisional Revolutionaries. These were a group who really were known for lots of different things. They were known for doing what it took to get elected. They said pretty much whatever the people wanted to hear, and they were very good at it. There were the Liberals. The Liberals represented primarily the middle class. A small party, Communist Party with some influence. Then there was the Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats were a communist party. In 1903, they had split. The split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Now, the Mensheviks were the old traditional Marxist communists. They believed that you slowly prepare society for the workers' revolution. That while it will take generations, it will happen inevitably, we will win. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, believed in creating revolution. Led by Lenin, Lenin, they believed that a small group of revolutionaries, and that's what Lenin wanted, a small group of revolutionaries who think, drank, and worked constantly for revolution could create a communist state. So it's not a Marxist state. He's not following pure Marxist ideas, although his end product is supposed to be a communist state. Lenin's right-hand man was a man named Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. And between Lenin and Trotsky, they caused a lot of trouble in Russia with protests and writings, so much so that whenever they got in real trouble, they usually took off. Lenin usually would go off to Geneva. Trotsky would go to New York. He had American relatives. When World War I broke out, both Lenin and Trotsky were nowhere to be found. They were in hiding or working in Russia, but very underground. They did not play a major role at the beginning of the war. When the war first began in 1914, Russia sent out the huge Russian army, and they, although having one or two victories, began to lose major battles in which not only did they lose many lives, but they lost huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers taken as prisoners. The problem with that was that they had to keep refilling the trenches, refilling the front lines, which meant that they took people off the farmland, they put them in the army, which meant that while they could fill in the gaps they were losing in the military, they were running on shortages of food. By 1916, you began to see shortages of food, not outright starvation, but certainly hunger, and people began to protest. Tsar Nicholas decided in 1916, made a very bad decision, certainly, that the reason the war was going so badly is because his generals had botched it, which was true, but he decided to take over. He went to the front lines, said, I'm taking over the war effort. The problem with that is that if he did well, great. But if he did badly, as he did, and the war did not go well for Russia, even after he took control, he had no one to blame. So by the end of 1916, not only do you have hunger throughout Russia, but the war is going badly. People are blaming the Tsar. And you begin in October of 1916, you have what is known as the Russian Revolution. This is when the people rose up, they overthrew the Tsar, and the Provisionals took over. And they were the most popular party in the Duma. The problem the Provisionals had, led by a man named Kerensky, Kerensky, is they really had played so many different sides before the war of what they were, different versions of what they were, that when the people finally turned and said, take charge, lead us, they didn't really know what they were. They were inconsistent, unstable, unsure exactly of how to rule this new Russia. In 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were ready to step into this vacuum of power. Lenin had been hiding in Switzerland, Geneva. The Germans took a private train and brought him into Russia, hoping that he would be the last straw in destabilizing Russia and getting Russia out of the war. Russia, despite all this, was still fighting on the Eastern Front. And they were right. Lenin and his Bolsheviks did. They began to organize. They created workers' groups called Soviets, organizations. They created the Red Army under Trotsky. And by October 1917, the Bolsheviks, now the Bolshevik Revolution, had overthrown the Russian government, throwing out the Provisionals and taking over every major city. Like the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution was at first and foremost an urban revolution. Between the two of them, Lenin and Trotsky, Trotsky is the military man. Although he was an academic and a scholar, he's the man who organized the Red Army. He's the man who organized the military strategy. The leader of the Bolsheviks, however, is Lenin, and Lenin is the politician. Lenin goes all over Russia in 1917 giving speeches. And all of his speeches have basically the same message. Support the Bolsheviks and we promise you land, bread, and peace. Land, bread, and peace. And we will give you the land you need to survive on, food will be accessible, and I will end this war. By the end of 1917, the Bolsheviks succeeded in taking control of most of Russia. And Lenin has to begin to fulfill some of his promises. Well, the main promise he made, and certainly his priority, was peace. He could not consolidate his power in Russia if he continued to have to fight a war. So in 1917, he signed a treaty with Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, B-R-E-S-T-L-I-T-O-V-S-K, Litovsk. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a treaty between Germany and Russia that ended the war for Russia. In order to get Germany to agree to this, he gave up a large portion of Russian land, a large portion of Russian population. But as it turns out, Lenin never had to really live up to these because Germany lost. So he didn't really lose so much at all. But what he gained was the end of the war. 1917 into 1918, Russia's now no longer fighting the war, and now Lenin begins to try to consolidate his power in Russia. Lenin is a communist. He wants to create a communist state. He is an active communist. Rather than sitting around waiting for the revolution to occur, he's going to make it happen. Well, he promised the people land and bread, but he didn't tell them exactly how they were going to get this. Under the new communist state, all the land is controlled by the state. All the cattle, all of the livestock, all of the grain, everything that anybody grows is all controlled by the state. The land that's going to be available is going to be available in large farming communities in which Russian workers will work for the benefit of the state as a whole, not as their own. Many Russian farmers were angered by this, protested this. They didn't know that what they were signing for was giving up their land and giving up their lifestyle, their independent lifestyle. And in protest, they began to destroy many of the crops, and they began to destroy their livestock. There'll be a part